Now that we have a basic domain model and therefore an ubiquitous language, we are almost ready to start explaining the building blocks of DDD. But before we start, we need to define one last aspect of our solution. This aspect is the architecture. With architecture, we are referring to the architecture styles and patterns that we are going to use to implement our solution. One of the big advantages of DDD is that it is agnostic to any architecture style or any architecture pattern. This means that DDD doesn't require the use of any specific architecture in order to be successful. What you need to do in order to define a proper architecture is to analyze the domain needs and requirements, and based on them, select the proper architecture styles and patterns. It's that simple. You define the architecture to satisfy business needs and not to follow a methodology. Just remember that the final goal is to use just the right choices and combinations of architecture styles and patterns. Now, just to give you a better idea of all the architecture styles and patterns, we are going to list out some of them for you. We are not going to explain them here, as that is not our goal, but we are going to share with you some interesting links. Go to each link and read about each one of them. There are also tons of information in internet. We are sure that after understand all of them, you will feel more confidence to apply DDD. The last bullet in the previous slide talks about the clean architecture. There, Robert Martin makes an attempt to integrate several architecture styles. In the article, Robert argues that if you separate the architecture in several layers, with well-defined responsibilities and following the dependency rule, you are going to create a system that is intrinsically testable, independent of frameworks, independent of UI, and independent of database. Pause the video and take a look to the dependency rule. This is an important rule and we are trying to follow it in our final solution architecture. Now that you know that we have a lot of architecture styles to choose, that we need to select properly the architecture styles and patterns based on the domain needs and requirements, that we need to define layers with clear responsibilities, and that we have the dependency rule, then it's time to define the architecture for our solution. In the next diagram, you are going to find our defined architecture. Basically, we have defined 4 layers: the infrastructure layer, the presentation layer, the application layer, and finally, the domain layer. The infrastructure layer acts as a supporting library for all the other layers. Here, we will find concrete implementations on abstractions defined in the different layers. For example, we will find here all the Hibernate repositories and the application event publisher. The presentation layer is responsible for presenting information to the user and also interpreting user commands. Here, we will find our REST API definition. The application layer is a thin layer which coordinates the application activity. It is the natural client of the domain layer. It does not contain business logic. Here we will find application services, data transfer objects, and transformers. The domain layer contains information about the domain. This is the heart of our application. All business logic is here. Here we will find our entities, value objects, domain services, domain events, repositories abstractions, and aggregates. And finally, the technology stack that we are going to use includes Java version 10, Gradle as a build automation system, Spring Boot 2.0 as our core framework, JPA with Hibernate as our ORM, and finally, we are going to use an in-memory relational database called H2. Now, we are ready to start building our application. Just one note before we continue. Please don't assume that all applications should use exactly the same architecture I just presented. This is the architecture we defined thinking in the scope and needs of this course and the domain introduced in the previous video. This is just one of multiple architectures we could have defined for this domain, needs and scope.